Yep, turns out you can just load up eBay, search prototype smartphone, and then buy one and have it delivered to your door. That's exactly what I did, and the best way I can describe this whole process is that it just feels so wrong. So today I want to explore the prototype that I bought on eBay. But before that, I am really trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that button, it genuinely would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you so much. So this is actually an HTC One M8 prototype. You know, that phone that many people call the absolute GOAT. I paid about £150 for this thing, and it's an earlier engineering sample with a few key changes from the original phone. For those who somehow don't know, the One M8 was a pioneer in the early transition from Android phones having a poor, cheap, almost tacky reputation to a time now where the higher end iPhone competing Androids are built so well, if not better than the iPhone, and are supported via software for as long or sometimes even longer. This was one of the key pivotal points for that change. It came out 10 whole years ago now. Yep, the full decade. That makes me feel incredibly old. So let's dig into this thing and what interesting changes were made in the One M8's creation process. First off, the fact that this is kind of matte black looking kind of makes it seem like an MKBHD masterstroke. It's not even funny. It's a really nice finish, to be fair, though I must say I do prefer the brushed metal of the final build. This is actually plastic, where that is made of metal. And talking of that outside finish, the squared off design almost resembles the predecessor, the HTC One M7, rather than the One M8, which is quite interesting. It almost looks like the middle glass section with the screen in it was what was ported over to the final build, and then the chin and forehead were kind of changed before the final release. Everything seems to work on it just fine. The display is as glorious as ever, the ports and connectors are all functional. It actually runs really smooth, holds a pretty impressive charge given just how old it is, although given it's an engineering sample, I'm sure people haven't dailied this thing and ruined the battery that way. I'm not sure why I'm surprised on the surface, but it all just feels very normal for a standard smartphone. The buttons and ports are all in the same place as they would be on the final M8, but interestingly, there is actually a camera bump on this thing, where the final device was actually praised for having a completely flush camera front element. Oh, and that's before we talk about the glaring omission. The depth camera. There's no depth camera on this thing. The additional sensor for capturing depth for the original phone's portrait mode is missing, as is the actual portrait mode itself in the camera app. Yeah, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because I'm sure you've noticed by now, but when the screen is on, there is actually a huge watermark that basically covers the entire display. It doesn't make the phone unusable, it doesn't get in the way of sort of touch recognition or anything, but yeah, you're not going to be using this thing as your daily driver, or if you are, power to you. It says confidential, which is slightly concerning, but since this is now 10 years old, I didn't sign any kind of NDA, and I bought it with my hard-earned money on eBay. I'm not liable here, and I'm sure this is absolutely fine. There are some pretty interesting pre-installed apps on this thing which we need to dig into. I haven't connected it to the internet because, well, I don't want it to sort of wipe itself or clear itself. I'm worried with that kind of thing. So I'm not going to be looking at it from a can you daily drive this smartphone perspective, because I want to check out what's actually on here. It's kind of wild. I think it's running Android 4.4 KitKat, and I say I think because when you actually go to check it in the settings, it just says protected, and the One M8 launched with 4.4 KitKat, so that's where my thought process lies here. It certainly feels like very early HTC One M8. Opening the app drawer, you have your standard apps like Play Store, Fitbit, Zoe, which was HTC's sort of photo and video social media combo, sort of like a bad Instagram kind of thing, and you could edit stuff in there. HTC Sense UI, which is the skin atop Android, was never hugely bloated, but this feels weirdly stripped down. Not how I remember it actually. But aside from these more basic applications, there are heaps of different dev tools. No, seriously, there's literally an app called DevTools. In here you'll find quick access to the Android developer options, cache abuser, configuration, package browser. There is a lot of stuff here, and I am not even remotely close to being qualified to actually tell you what any of it really does. I'm not a developer myself, and I don't know what most of this stuff even means. But it's, I'm sure, very useful in the development process. In theory, this stuff can be found in the final versions of the phone, but just hidden from everyone else. Or maybe they're just removed for the public version, so I'm not sure. But I imagine if those things were in the final build and left there for the public, they would probably end up breaking their own phones. So I'm glad that we don't have these kinds of things on every phone. The bit I'm actually really intrigued by is this app called HTC SSD Test Tool. Now, surely this isn't the SSD that I instantly think of, solid state drive, because when you tap into it, there are loads of stuff and none of it is related to a storage device. And going to guess that HTC's test tool is where a lot of the checking and testing and development is done. The dev would go in, make an adjustment or implement a new feature and then test it with the tools in this app. I'm sure there'll be a dev or two in the comments that can let me know what most of this stuff means and can actually educate all of us, because this isn't just a me thing here. There are some more obvious ones, like being able to test the LED, which for some reason doesn't work on this phone. Stuff like system properties, which returns a huge list of, well, the title kind of says it all. And there's a touch monitor for illustrating where the screen digitizer recognizes the touch on the display. You can do stuff like test the vibration motor, set a duration and just have it run the motor if you wanted to ruin the battery, I guess. Pretty basic stuff, but it all makes sense because when you're building a phone, you have to test every little detail. So yeah, I guess that was probably loaded onto pretty much every prototype, not just this one. Ironically, my unit actually runs quicker than my final HTC One M8. I'm not sure if this is just because there are basically no apps installed, because no one's used the battery, so that hasn't degraded. The fact it's not connected to the internet, so it hasn't updated itself. And to be fair, the final One M8 that I have is not running the final software, it's running like a custom OS, and it's done the rounds. Like, I wasn't the first owner of that phone, and I sent it around to a load of my friends to make videos with, so yeah, it's certainly not in the best state compared to one of these. But yeah, I just found it interesting that the developer version just ran quite a bit quicker. I want to ask those of you who were into phones back then, like I was, this was basically my peak interest in smartphones, whether you'd have preferred something that looks a little bit like this, or the final build. Would you have preferred the tighter corners, the lack of the depth camera, or are you glad that HTC made those changes and, you know, ended up with what we did get in the end? Do any of you have any prototypes or engineering samples? Because they're actually more on eBay than you might think. And heck, were you an HTC dev? Did you hold this very unit? Let me know in the comments. I would absolutely love to hear your stories. I'm, once again, a complete novice when it comes to any kind of engineering or development, so the more I learn about this, the more I just want to learn more. The more I poked about with it and used the M8 prototype, the more I really started to feel like it's a real shame that HTC stopped making smartphones, or at least, you know, ones as good as this. I remember the M7 coming out and being increasingly envious of people around me who could actually afford that thing, because we were all kids at the time. It was such a grand departure from what came before it. The One M8 came out and I was in love with the thing. I didn't actually get my hands on one until my friend Hayden lent me one a couple of years after release. And that's when I started making YouTube videos on this channel, 8 years ago. And what an absolutely beautiful thing that was. The blue finish on it was just marvelous. One of the most incredible devices ever. Remember, this was a year before Samsung had its Galaxy S6, which really helped turn the tide and change the reputation of the hardware experience for Android phones. The One M8 was such a huge device, not physically, but you know what I mean. And I did a dedicated video for it over on Android Play, so definitely check that video out if you want a big story on actually the full phone and not just about this little engineering sample. This was one of the most surreal and strange experiences I've had with smartphones, certainly for a little while at the very least. Just being able to load up eBay, search prototype, hit buy, and then less than a week later just have it rock up to your door feels incredibly wrong, but a really cool experience nonetheless. I bought a prototype on eBay, and honestly, it's fascinating to check out a piece of history and something that would go on to be one of the greatest phones ever made.